Welcome to Ancient Whispers. Tonight, let your shoulders drop, your eyelids soften, and your mind begin to drift as we step into a quiet little journey. Not one of dragons or distant kingdoms, but something simpler and perhaps more real. This evening, I invite you to walk beside a solitary traveler and his stubborn little donkey as they make their way through the misty hills of southern France in a time before cars, before phones, before noise. This is the story of a man who wandered slowly across the Cevennes mountains with nothing but a tent, a few loaves of bread, and a gray donkey named Modestine. You don't need to know where the Cevennes are, or even when this happened. All you need is to lie back, breathe gently, and listen as we begin in a stone-built village called Le Monastier. I had been living in Le Monastier for nearly a month, a small, crooked village perched on a high plateau in southern France, where the morning fog clings to chimney tops and the sound of church bells floats softly through the cool air. Le Monastier had everything a man needs when he's preparing to leave: a blacksmith to repair old tools, a grocer who sold both rope and red wine, and plenty of villagers, each with a firm and completely contradictory opinion on how to handle a donkey. I spent the early days looking for just the right beast to carry my belongings. Not a horse, too proud and too expensive. Not a cart, too bulky. A donkey was just right. Humble, reliable, and, they say, loyal, if it likes you. Eventually, I met Modestine. She was a small gray donkey with sleepy eyes and drooping ears. There was something in her expression, calm, patient, and deeply unimpressed, that made me feel an odd sort of kinship. Her previous owner, a widow, assured me, "She's gentle as autumn wind, but monsieur, you must be patient." I nodded, full of confidence only a first-time donkey owner could possess. I paid 65 francs and left the market with my new traveling companion, already imagining how poetic our journey would be. I packed my supplies into a thick leather bag, a folding tent, a wool blanket, some dry bread, chocolate, a small bottle of brandy, and a book to read by lantern light if the nights weren't too cold. The townsfolk watched me prepare as though I were setting off for the North Pole. They offered me thick cloaks, heavy boots, even a fur cap. I politely refused. A real walker, I told myself, travels light and slow. On the morning of our departure, the air was crisp and damp. The sun peeked over the rooftops like a shy coin left forgotten on a wooden table. I tied the bags onto Modestine's back. She groaned, softly, like she was sighing at her fate. I led her through the village square. Old men nodded, children ran alongside us. I tried to look composed, like a man on a mission. Inside, I was buzzing with nerves. Beyond the village, the road sloped gently downhill, curving past potato fields and dry stone fences. The grass was still wet with dew. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once. Then silence. Modestine walked very slowly. Not because she was tired, but because she simply chose to. I tapped her side gently. She stopped. I murmured an encouragement. She blinked. I clicked my tongue. She lifted one huff and then put it back down. We moved like that, at the pace of poetry written in molasses, each step a thought, each pause a paragraph. And so the journey began, not with trumpets or fanfare, but with the clatter of hoofs on a dirt road, the rustle of wind through oak leaves, and a silence so soft it felt like a blanket draped over the world. I didn't know where we'd end up. I wasn't even sure how far we'd get. But with a rough map, a stubborn donkey, and a heart willing to be surprised, I thought,
Perhaps that was enough. The road narrowed as we left Le Monastier behind. Grass crept between the stones, and brambles brushed our ankles as we moved through the gentle folds of the countryside. Early autumn was soft and generous. The leaves still clung to the trees, but their colors had begun to blush. Pale gold, quiet amber, the first hints of copper. Modestine walked with the slow, unbothered pace of someone with absolutely nowhere to be. I admired it at first. There was something zen about it, something profoundly resistant to the modern rush of things. But after an hour of moving perhaps a quarter of a mile, the admiration began to fray. I tried reasoning with her. "We must go, dear Modestine," I said, my voice still calm. She blinked slowly and shifted her weight to the other leg. I nudged her gently. She sighed, long and deep, like a philosopher tired of repeating herself. And then she stood still. I had been warned about donkeys. Everyone in Le Monastier had something to say. "Don't pull too hard. You must carry a stick. Never carry a stick. They resent it. Speak firmly. Don't shout. Sing to her." One old man even told me to whisper family secrets to build trust. I considered trying it. I stood beside her in the sun, both of us silent. Birds sang in the hedges. A breeze ruffled the grass. Eventually, I gave in and walked forward on my own, thinking she might follow. She didn't. I returned, more desperate than dignified. I tried gentle coaxing, a bit of bribery, even flattery. Nothing worked. And so, ashamed and slightly defeated, I purchased a switch from a nearby farmer, a slender branch no thicker than a finger. I used it sparingly, but it made a difference. Modestine was not hurt, her pride, perhaps, but she moved. With a rhythm, now, we began to cover ground. We passed low stone cottages, with smoke curling from their chimneys. In the distance, I could see the Cevennes rising, jagged lines drawn against the sky, their flanks dusted with early shadow. There was something ancient in those hills, as if they had been watching for centuries, unimpressed by pilgrims and wanderers. I wondered how many souls had walked these paths before me, how many had spoken to donkeys and stared at moss-covered stones. At midday, I found a small clearing beside a stream. The water was clear and cold, and it sang over the rocks in a language older than French. I unpacked a little bread and cheese, poured a sip of wine, and lay down in the grass. Modestine grazed nearby, tail flicking gently, her large eyes half closed with indifference. There, in that moment, the journey felt whole. No destination, no clock, only the sun above, the water beside me, and the earth under my back. After our rest, we resumed our pace, still modest, but now steady. We met few people. A shepherd and his dog, both of whom looked at us with a kind of quiet sympathy. A woman gathering mushrooms, who offered me one raw and strange, and assured me it was good for the dreams. The landscape began to shift, gently at first, then more dramatically. The road wound up into ridges where the wind came sharper, and the trees leaned sideways. Valleys opened below us, pockets of green among the rugged brown. I began to sweat under my coat. Modestine, to her credit, did not complain. She simply trudged on, ears flicking, hooves clicking on the rocky trail. We climbed a small hill near the end of the afternoon. At the top, we found a stone bench and a view that took my breath, or perhaps the climb had already stolen it. From that height, I could see back toward Le Monastier, the rooftops now tiny, the smoke no more than threads, and far ahead, a horizon of ridges like frozen waves waiting to be crossed. As the sky began to deepen and the shadows lengthened, I started to look for a place to sleep. I had brought a tent, a contraption of canvas and poles, which I had practiced assembling back in the village square to the amusement of several local children. Setting it up alone was not easy. Setting it up with a curious donkey stepping on the corners was nearly impossible. Eventually, I coaxed Modestine away, hammered the stakes into soft ground, and crawled inside. The earth was cool beneath me. The canvas smelled of dust and something oddly comforting, like old libraries and forgotten pages. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Somewhere nearby, an owl called once. I lay in my little tent, wrapped in my blanket, the stars overhead blinking like distant campfires. Modestine stood just outside, a quiet sentinel in the dusk. I could hear her breathing, steady and warm. Not a companion of words, perhaps, but one of presence. And presence, I thought, is no small thing in a world that never stops talking.
The morning arrived without ceremony. Pale light seeped through the canvas of my tent, gently rousing me from sleep. I opened one eye, then the other. The air was cold, not biting, but firm, like a hand placed on your shoulder to say, "Time to go." Outside, the grass shimmered with dew. The trees whispered among themselves, saying things the wind carried away before I could catch them. Modestine stood nearby, already awake, blinking slowly at nothing in particular. She looked as if she had never slept at all, or as if sleep were something beneath her. Either way, she seemed entirely unbothered by our vagabond state. I made a quiet breakfast, bread slightly stiff from the night's damp, a bit of cheese and some strong coffee warmed over a flame that smoked more than it burned. The smell was sharp and comforting. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, watching the day unfold. We packed slowly. There was no rush. The world would not move faster because of me. I strapped the tent to Modestine's back, careful not to let it slip to one side. She watched with her usual expression, not displeased, just detached, as though she were mentally elsewhere, perhaps composing poetry about the futility of human endeavors. Our journey resumed down a narrow path, flanked by chestnut trees. Fallen leaves crunched beneath our feet. Somewhere high above, unseen birds chirped in short bursts. The rhythm of walking returned, familiar and oddly reassuring. The soft plop of hooves, the rustle of pack straps, and the steady breath of forward motion. The path dipped into a shallow valley where the air grew damp and full of earthy scent, moss, wet bark, the old perfume of old rain. As we passed a ruined stone wall, I noticed an old milestone carved with letters nearly worn smooth by centuries of weather. I ran my fingers over the cold surface. Someone long ago had stood here too, perhaps tired, perhaps hopeful. The idea comforted me more than I expected. We stopped to rest near a trickling stream. I let Modestine drink while I leaned against a mossy rock, watching clouds drift across a sky that was neither blue nor gray, just pale, like porcelain. I took out my journal and wrote a few lines. Nothing profound, just thoughts to anchor the moment. There was a pleasure in recording simple things, the shape of a tree, the mood of the sky, the tilt of a donkey's ears. It was a kind of prayer, I suppose. In the afternoon, the hills rose again, and the road grew steeper. We moved slower, even for us. I walked ahead, leading Modestine by the reins. She didn't resist exactly, but she didn't assist either. Her steps were deliberate, reluctant, as though she were weighing each one for meaning. Now and then I turned and spoke to her, softly, sometimes kindly, sometimes with mild sarcasm. She never replied, but I often felt she was listening. At least, I preferred to believe that.
We passed a grove of pine trees where the air grew still and full of shadow. It was quiet in that way that feels ancient, the kind of quiet that makes you speak in whispers even when you're alone. I stopped and looked back. No one followed. There were no sounds of people or carts, just Modestine and me, two small lives crossing a very old landscape. Later that day, the clouds gathered thick and low. The sky turned the color of pewter, and the wind sharpened at the edges. I pulled up my collar. Modestine's ears flattened briefly, then returned to their usual gentle droop. A few drops of rain fell, heavy, spaced like slow thoughts. Then more followed, steady and sure. I paused to cover Modestine's pack with a flap of canvas and pulled my own coat tighter. The road curved into a deep forest. The trees were tall and close together, their trunks like pillars holding up the darkening sky. The rain fell in soft patters on leaves, a rhythm that matched our steps. We moved quietly. There was something sacred in that walk. Not joyful, not sad, just present. Every step was now. Eventually, as the light began to fade, I saw a glimmer of smoke rising through the trees. A farmhouse stood just off the path, its roof slanted and patched with moss. A thin column of smoke rose from the chimney, curling against the gray. I approached slowly. A dog barked once, not unfriendly, just surprised. A woman appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at me with calm eyes, then at Modestine, then back at me. I greeted her politely and asked if I might camp nearby. She nodded and gestured toward a patch of dry ground behind the house. That night I set up the tent under the shelter of a broad oak. The rain eased to a drizzle. I sat with my back against the tree, sipping warm broth the woman had kindly offered. Modestine stood under a small lean-to, chewing slowly, the picture of peace. There was no sound of carriages or footsteps, no ticking clocks or hurried voices, only the quiet breathing of land and sky. I thought of all the places I had lived, the streets and cities, the lights that never go out, and I thought of this moment, sitting beside a tree with a donkey and a bowl of soup in a nameless corner of France. It was, strangely, enough. The stars emerged one by one, shy and silver. The clouds drifted away like forgotten worries. I crawled into my tent, pulled the blanket around my shoulders, and let my body surrender to stillness. Outside, the forest watched in silence, and Modestine, my quiet, stubborn companion, shuffled once, then settled into her rest. Sleep came gently, like fog rolling over a meadow, like the hush that follows a prayer. And the journey, still slow, still unfolding, would continue when the sun returned.
The morning air was clean, as if the rain had washed not just the earth, but the sky itself. I rose slowly, stretched, and stepped out from the tent. The clouds had lifted in the night, leaving behind a clarity that made the leaves sparkle. Drops of water clung to everything, fence posts, donkey ears, blades of grass, each one holding a sliver of the morning sun. Modestine blinked at me with her usual composure, already standing as though she had been waiting. I gave her a quiet pat on the neck. She yawned. It was the first time I had seen a donkey yawn, and I was somehow honored. We shared a modest breakfast. Bread again, a bit stale, and a small apple sliced in two. I offered half to Modestine. She sniffed it with interest, then slowly accepted it, chewing with thoughtful determination. By mid-morning, we were back on the trail. The road twisted through low hills and hedgerows.
winding toward a village whose name I had never heard until the day before. We moved at our own pace, which is to say very slowly, but the world seemed to match it. Nothing rushed. The birds took their time. The breeze wandered. Even the clouds above us floated as if unsure where they were going. Soon we passed a wide meadow where goats grazed under the eye of a lone shepherd. He wore a cloak that might have been older than either of us, and he nodded silently as we passed. Modestine gave him a glance, then continued chewing. It felt, for a moment, like something from a story, the kind told around a fire, with embers dancing and eyes half closed. By midday, the path widened into a dusty road leading toward the village. Stone walls lined either side, topped with moss and stubborn little flowers. I could see rooftops ahead, small, slanted, and gray with age. There were no signs, no loud voices, no church bells. We entered quietly, as one might enter a library. The houses were built close together, their shutters painted in faded hues of grain and blue. Some were crooked, leaning slightly, as though tired of standing straight. Laundry fluttered from windows, and cats patrolled the narrow lanes with the dignity of old magistrates. A child sat on a doorstep, legs swinging, holding a crust of bread. He watched us with wide, curious eyes, but said nothing. I led Modestine through the main street, though it was hardly wider than a hallway, and found a small square at its center. A fountain burbled quietly there, its stone basin worn smooth by time and hands and rain. I let Modestine drink while I sat on the fountain's edge, stretching my legs and taking in the stillness. There was a small inn nearby, with a wooden sign hanging above its door, an image of a donkey and a walking stick. I smiled at the coincidence. Or was it an omen? Either way, I took it as a gentle nod from the universe. A woman came out to greet me. She wore a wide apron and smelled faintly of flour. She spoke softly, asking where I had come from and where I was going. I answered as best I could. When I said I preferred to sleep outdoors, she gave me a puzzled look but did not argue. Instead, she offered bread and a bit of goat cheese, which I accepted with quiet gratitude. I spent a few hours resting in the square, watching the light shift across the cobblestones. Time moved differently there, or perhaps it didn't move at all. I asked someone what time it was, and he shrugged with a smile. He said, "We don't keep clocks. The sun tells us enough." It was a kind of wisdom I found deeply soothing. Later, I walked Modestine to the edge of the village and found a soft patch of ground near a line of cypress trees. The earth was dry, the grass short and inviting. I pitched the tent again, faster this time, though still not gracefully. Modestine settled beside it without protest. I unstrapped her pack and brushed her coat with a bundle of pine needles. She tolerated it, even seemed to enjoy it. There was something satisfying about the slow rhythm of brushing, the quiet connection of it. As dusk fell, the village seemed to grow quieter still, as if preparing for its own sleep. There were no street lamps, no carriages rattling by, just the sound of the breeze slipping between shutters and the occasional murmur of someone telling a story too softly to hear. That night I sat under the cypress trees, wrapped in my coat, staring up at the stars. They were brighter here, as though no one had ever told them to dim. A fox crossed the far edge of the meadow, graceful and silent. Modestine didn't move. She was already dreaming, or pretending to. I sipped from my flask, just a bit of wine, and felt the day settle into my bones, not as fatigue, but as fullness, as if the hours had been food. When at last I lay down, The canvas above me swayed gently in the breeze. The night air was cool and full of that soft kind of silence that wraps around you like a blanket, the kind that doesn't just help you sleep, but makes you want to stay asleep for a long while. And beside me, Modestine shifted once, exhaled, and returned to her dreams. I woke before the sun. The sky was still dark, but not entirely. There was a faint paleness to the east, like the breath of dawn before it speaks. The ground was cold beneath me. I lay still for a while, listening. Somewhere nearby, an owl offered one last call before retiring. A breeze moved gently through the trees, rustling the leaves in slow applause. Modestine was already awake, as usual. She stood motionless, facing nothing in particular, but somehow giving the impression of deep contemplation, or mild disdain. I rose and stretched. My breath fogged in the air. I boiled water for coffee, the little flame dancing under the tin pot. Steam curled upward like a spirit leaving for its morning stroll. There was something sacred about those early hours, the quiet before the world remembered it had things to do. After breakfast, we packed slowly. I had become more skilled with the straps, though Modestine still gave me her look of long-suffering patience. I thanked her out loud, partly for the company, partly out of habit. The road today would take us higher, into the hills, where the land wrinkled like the pages of an old map. We passed the edge of the village without seeing another soul. Everyone was still indoors, wrapped in sleep or morning silence. The path climbed gently at first. Stone walls lined our way, broken in places by wild thyme and glove club. The stones were warm-colored, ochre, rust, the dusty brown of old bread. As we rose, the village disappeared behind us. The land opened up. There was a moment, brief and perfect, when we crested a hill and saw the valley spread below. Fields folded into one another like linen sheets. A ribbon of river shimmered in the distance, catching the morning light like a blade. Pines stood in clusters, guardians of the quiet. I stopped and let the view rest in my eyes. Modestine, unimpressed, took the opportunity to nibble on a stubborn clump of grass near the path. I let her. It was good to remember that while I was having spiritual revelations about the majesty of nature, she was hungry. We walked for several hours, mostly in silence. Occasionally I would hum, more to keep rhythm than to entertain. I tried an old marching song once, but Modestine stopped entirely as if offended by the tempo. So I returned to silence. Around midday we came upon a small chapel. More a ruin, really. Only 3 walls remained and the roof had long since surrendered to the sky. But the doorway still stood, arched and dignified. I stepped inside. Grass grew where pews once stood. A single stone cross remained above what had once been the altar. Birdsong filled the empty space. It felt like prayer. I sat for a while on a chunk of fallen wall. The sun drifted through the open ceiling, warming the broken stones. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I wasn't a traveler or a writer or anything with a name. I was just still. We continued upward. The trail narrowed into a path that seemed unsure of itself. It wound between rocks and clung to hillsides like a ribbon half unraveled. But the view grew more generous with every step. Eventually we reached a plateau, a wide, wind-swept place where grass is bent all in one direction and nothing stood still. The wind here was stronger, more assertive. It pushed at us, not cruelly, but with purpose. I pulled my coat tighter. Modestine leaned into the wind as if bracing herself against invisible opinions. In the distance stood a shepherd's hut, a low, square building of stone, roofed with thick slates. Smoke rose from its chimney in a thin line. I hesitated, unsure if we were welcome, but the door creaked open before I could decide. A man stepped out, weathered and wide-shouldered, with a beard that matched the stones. He raised a hand in greeting. I returned the gesture. We spoke only a little. He offered bread and strong tea, which I accepted. Modestine was given water and a patch of grass out of the wind. Inside the hut was warmth and the smell of wool and firewood. He had no furniture, only a bench and a blanket-covered pile of hay, but he offered a place by the fire, and I sat gladly. He asked where I was from. I told him. He nodded as though that explained everything. Then he said nothing else, and I found that perfect. I left him with thanks and a piece of cheese from my pack. He accepted it with a quiet nod and returned to the doorway to watch the clouds. Some people live their whole lives in a single square of land and know it better than others know the world. We descended again, following the edge of a long slope that curved gently toward a stream. The water there was clear and cold, flowing over smooth stones like glass in motion. I let Modestine drink while I knelt to fill my tin cup. The chill of it ran through me, not unpleasant, just honest. By late afternoon, the trees returned, tall pines that lined the trail like solemn watchers. I began looking for a place to sleep and found one near a bend in the stream where the grass grew thick. I cleared a small patch for the tent, and Modestine, ever practical, settled herself without waiting for instructions. As I unpacked, the first stars appeared above the trees. The wind had gentled. The air was full of the scent of pine and damp earth. Somewhere nearby, a nightjar called once, then fell silent. I lit my little lamp and sat by its glow, writing a few lines in my notebook. The road is long, but the day is full. The donkey slow, but the silence kind. I smiled at the thought. Later I lay under canvas once more. The world outside breathed slowly. And sleep, always a faithful traveler, came soon, soft-footed and without demands, and joined us under the sheltering dark.
The morning began with mist. It rolled across the ground in soft waves, wrapping the trees and rocks and stream as if the night itself were reluctant to leave. The sun, hidden behind a veil of cloud, offered only a faint glow, not enough to warm, but enough to reassure. I opened my eyes slowly, uncertain at first if I were still dreaming. The air was cool, my breath rose in small clouds. From beneath the canvas of the tent, I saw Modestine standing just a few feet away, unmoving, as if she too were waiting for the day to begin. I rose, stretched, and stepped outside. The grass was wet beneath my boots. I gave Modestine a gentle pat, and she blinked up at me with those slow, unreadable eyes. Breakfast was quiet. A heel of bread, a sliver of hard cheese, and a sip of water chilled by the night air. We did not speak, for there was nothing that needed saying. By the time we were packed and ready, the mist had begun to lift, dissolving into the treetops and slipping silently into the sky. The trail led upward again, through a narrow gorge where moss covered every stone and silence lingered like incense. Birds chirped softly in the distance, but otherwise all was still. Even our footsteps, hers deliberate, mine hesitant, made only the gentlest sounds against the damp earth. After an hour, the gorge opened into a small plateau. There, at the center, stood a church. It had no door, only an open arch where one must have been. The roof was intact, but parts of the walls had begun to crumble. Vines crept along the outer stones, and ivy clung to the bell tower like a child holding tight to its parent's coat.
Inside, it was hollow and still. I led Modestine to a patch of grass outside and stepped in alone. The wooden pews were mostly gone, only a few remained, warped and worn by time. Light streamed through a tall window, catching dust in its beam and turning it to gold. There was no altar, no candles, no sound, and yet it felt full, not of people, but of memory. I sat quietly on one of the remaining benches, not to pray, not exactly, but simply to be still in a place that seemed built for stillness. A swallow darted in through the empty doorway and circled once above my head before slipping back into the air. I watched it go. After some time, I returned to Modestine. She looked up as I approached, then returned her attention to a patch of grass she had been considering. Her patience, as always, was infinite. We continued on, the trail now wide enough for us to walk side by side. I told her about the church. She made no reply, but I imagined her saying, "Stone is stone, and grass is grass. Both are honest. That's enough." Perhaps she was right. The sun rose higher, and with it came warmth. The trees thinned, giving way to rolling meadows and distant hills that seemed to rise and fall like the backs of sleeping giants. At midday, we came upon a shepherd's camp, just a low stone wall and a small fire pit, now cold. A few sheep grazed nearby, but there was no one in sight. We rested there. I took off my pack and lay back against a smooth rock. Modestine wandered a few paces away, found a spot she liked, and settled in the grass with a satisfied grunt. I closed my eyes. The breeze was soft, carrying with it the scent of thyme and sun-warmed stone. I might have dozed, I can't be sure, but when I opened my eyes again, nothing had changed. And that, I realized, was the gift of this place. Stillness, without stagnation. Time passed, but it did not chase. Later, we crossed a ridge and began descending into a small valley. A brook danced beside the trail, hopping from rock to rock, singing its clear, cold song. We stopped at its edge. Modestine drank deeply, her ears twitching with every sound. I knelt beside her and let the water run through my fingers. It was sharp, almost startling, and then, somehow, it was comforting. I drank, wiped my mouth, and looked up at the sky. Clouds moved slowly above us, drifting without destination. I envied them a little. The valley ended at a tiny hamlet, 3 houses and a chapel smaller than most kitchens. Smoke rose from one chimney. A child peeked at us from behind a curtain. No one came out. Still, I nodded politely to the windows as we passed, and spoke to Modestine in a low voice, as if we were visitors at a museum of forgotten places. A narrow path led us back into the trees. That night I chose a spot among the pines. The ground was soft, covered in needles. The air smelled of resin and cool earth. I set the tent beneath a low bough and gathered a few stones to circle my small fire. As darkness fell, I warmed a bit of soup and sat close to the flame. The stars appeared one by one, like old friends arriving late to a quiet gathering. Modestine lay nearby, her eyes closed but ears alert. I watched the firelight flicker on her fur and felt a quiet affection rise in me. Not just for her, but for the road itself, for its gentle lessons, for the way it moved without asking me to hurry. Later, as the fire faded and the night deepened, I wrote a single line in my notebook. A church with no door, and still it welcomed me. Then I set the book aside and lay back and let the pine-scented air carry me gently toward sleep. I woke to the hush of a pine forest, wrapped in a silence so deep it seemed to pulse. The fire from the night before had faded to soft gray embers, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and resin. Light filtered through the branches, dappling the ground in golden patches. I lay still for a while, listening, not for any particular sound, but for the quiet itself. Modestine stirred nearby. Her ears twitched, but she did not rise. She was in no hurry, and neither was I. We began the day slowly. I boiled water and sipped warm tea, holding the tin cup in both hands to catch the heat. Modestine munched on some leftover oats with the calm satisfaction of one who never questions the shape of the day ahead. The trail led us downward, into what the map named simply as the valley. There were no villages marked, no landmarks, just a long green space surrounded by hills. The earth was soft beneath our feet, muffled by fallen needles and damp leaves. Above us the canopy opened now and then to reveal a sky the color of worn linen. A crow passed overhead in silence. As we descended, the trees began to thin. The path grew softer, and the light took on a cooler hue, as though we were walking into the memory of morning, rather than its present form. Then, quite suddenly, we emerged into the valley. And it was still. Not empty, not dead, but hushed, as if everything here had agreed to whisper. The grass waved slowly in a breeze I could not feel. A narrow stream wound through the middle, its surface barely rippled. The trees stood at the valley's edge like an audience that had paused mid-applause. Modestine stopped. She looked around, ears forward. I felt it too, a quiet so complete it pressed gently on the skin. We moved along the stream. Wildflowers dotted the banks, pale blue, deep purple, and white as milk. A pair of dragonflies hovered near the water, dancing in loops without ever touching the surface. I said nothing. Even my thoughts seemed softer here. At one point, I passed an old wooden fence, the last remnant, perhaps, of a shepherd's plot or forgotten garden. It leaned, sun-bleached and laced with moss. Modestine walked beside me without fuss, her hooves making only the faintest sound. Around midday, we reached a bend in the stream where the water pooled briefly in a still, clear mirror. I sat there, pulled off my boots, and dipped my feet into the chill. The cold was bracing, and then soothing, 1,000 tiny needles that softened into calm. I leaned back on my elbows and looked at the sky. Clouds passed slowly. A hawk traced wide, lazy circles overhead. Time, it seemed, had stopped to rest beside me. I ate lunch there, a crust of bread, a slice of dried apple, and a few walnuts. Modestine grazed nearby, occasionally flicking her tail in casual protest at some invisible annoyance. I thought about nothing in particular, the kind of thinking that's really just drifting, like leaves floating downstream, moving only because the water does. Eventually, I dried my feet, put on my boots, and we continued. The second half of the day passed like a dream. The path curved gently through the valley, never steep, never sharp. At one point we passed a large stone cross set in the ground, overgrown with ivy. There was no name, no plaque, no explanation, only the cross and the quiet. It felt more like a marker of peace than sorrow. As we walked, I spoke aloud to Modestine, not out of need, but out of comfort. I told her that if I ever disappeared, this would be the place I'd wish to be found. She snorted as if to say, "I'd find you," eventually. Toward evening, the valley began to rise again, and we followed the path uphill through a scattering of birch trees. Their white bark glowed softly in the waning light, and the sound of the stream faded behind us, replaced by the hush of wind through leaves. I found a spot for the night on a small hill that looked back over the valley. I set up the tent with care, and sat cross-legged at its entrance, watching the sky turn from blue to amber to slate. Modestine settled nearby, her legs tucked beneath her, eyes half closed. Dinner was simple: lentils warmed over the fire, a bit of hard sausage, and water from the stream. I ate slowly, letting each bite anchor me in the moment. Above, the stars emerged, first one, then three, then dozens, arranged in patient, glowing silence. I wrapped my blanket around my shoulders and let the fire crackle. The sound of it reminded me of distant rain or old parchment crumbling gently in a forgotten drawer. There was no loneliness here, only solitude, the good kind. Before sleep, I wrote, "Today we walked through a whisper, a valley that spoke in hush and hush alone, and yet it said so much." Then I set the notebook aside. As I lay down, Modestine gave one soft exhale, like the sigh of a friend who has finally found a comfortable place to rest. And together, without ceremony, we drifted into the silence of night.
Morning came quietly, wrapped in a shawl of mist. It crept in through the trees, soft as breath, clinging to every branch and stone. When I opened the tent flap, the world outside looked like a dream, still undecided whether to remain or fade. The pines stood like ghosts, tall and patient. Modestine blinked at me through the fog. Her fur was damp with dew, and her breath came in small clouds. She looked unimpressed by the weather, though not especially bothered. I boiled water and warmed a bit of bread over the fire. The smoke curled upward and vanished almost instantly into the gray above. No bird song, no wind, just the quiet sigh of mist drifting across the earth. We began the day slowly. The trail ahead was barely visible. Trees faded in and out of sight like old memories, sometimes close, sometimes lost. Even Modestine's footsteps sounded muffled, absorbed by the wet ground. It felt like walking through a painting. I kept my voice low, though I said little. To speak too loudly in such a place would feel like knocking over a stack of books in a library, possible but unkind. A fox crossed the path ahead of us, silent, unhurried. It paused to glance in our direction, then disappeared into the fog without a sound. A passing thought, made flesh and gone again. Around mid-morning, the mist began to lift, not quickly, but in fragments. First the tops of trees, then the curve of a hill, then a sliver of blue sky like a secret being told piece by piece. And there, tucked between two wooded slopes, appeared a village. It wasn't marked on my map. Just a handful of stone houses, their roofs heavy with moss, a bell tower, a garden or two. Smoke rose from one chimney, curling into the thinning mist like a whispered greeting. We approached slowly. The village had no name that I could find, no signs, no markers, just the quiet rhythm of old stone and older wood. A dog barked once, not angrily, but with the sort of voice that says, "I see you, that's all." Then it wandered off around the side of a house, tail wagging slightly. I led Modestine to a watering trough, where she drank gratefully. The water was cold and clear,
fed by a pipe from the hillside. No one emerged from the houses, and yet I did not feel unwelcome, only observed, as if the village itself was watching, not to judge, but to remember. I walked to the chapel at the far end. It was small, perhaps only large enough for 12 people. Its door stood open. Inside there were no pews, just a single bench and a stone basin filled with water that reflected the arched window above. I stepped in and sat. The air smelled of old wood and candle wax, though I saw no candles lit. The silence was so complete I could hear my heartbeat echo in my ears. Then, from somewhere behind me, the bell rang once. Just once. Not a chime for service, not a warning, just a single note, as if to say, "You are here." When I stepped back outside, the mist had all but gone. Sunlight filtered down in golden beams, catching the dust in the air and turning it into something holy. Modestine waited by the trough, one hoof resting, her ears relaxed. I gave her a pat, and she snorted softly, as if to say, "You've had your moment, let's go." And so we did. The path led out of the village and back into the forest, where birds had begun to sing again. The trail was lined with ferns and soft moss, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. I walked in silence for a long time, the echo of the bell still warm in my chest. By afternoon, we reached a clearing where the sun poured down like honey. There, I unpacked a small lunch and sat cross-legged in the grass while Modestine grazed nearby. I thought about the village, about how it wasn't on the map, about how nothing in it tried to hold me, and yet it stayed with me all the same. There was something deeply restful in being forgotten by the world, even for just a morning. After lunch, the trail grew steeper. Rocks jutted out like old bones beneath the soil, and Modestine grumbled at the effort. I paused often, not out of necessity, but because the views behind us were worth turning to see. The forest opened now and then to reveal the valley below. Mist gone, sunlight dancing on the stream, the roofs of the little village like stones resting in a patch of moss. A place that may or may not be remembered. A place I would not forget. That evening we camped on a ledge above the tree line. The sky was wide and blue, streaked with the first hints of evening. The wind tugged gently at the tent as I set it up, and the pine trees whispered in the background like storytellers who never ran out of tales. Dinner was quiet, just soup and a few crumbs of bread. But the stars came early, and with them a peace that sank into my bones like warmth from within. I wrote a single line in my notebook before sleep. Some places do not call you to stay, but they leave a light on just in case. Then I lay back, Modestine at my side, the stars above, and the memory of mist still cool in my lungs. And sleep came like the fog, soft, slow, and full of grace. Morning arrived with a hush and a hush again. Clouds drifted low across the sky, and the air felt full, not with wind or sound, but with the kind of weight that suggests rain is coming. The trees stood still, their leaves poised like open hands. I made tea and packed slowly. Modestine didn't hurry either. She seemed to sense what was coming. By the time we stepped onto the path again, the first drops had begun. Soft, hesitant, as if the sky were testing the world's patience. We pressed on. The forest faded behind us as we climbed a gentle ridge. The trees thinned. Shrubs gave way to rock and grass. The world opened wider and flatter. A plateau stretched out before us like a forgotten rooftop. And the rain grew steady, not harsh, but constant, a fine, even drizzle that soaked without sting. Our path became a muddy thread, winding through gray-green hills. Modestine plodded on with stoic calm, her ears angled back, but not unhappy. I pulled my cloak tighter and focused on the rhythm of walking. One step, another, the sound of rain on cloth, on grass, on the metal tin that clinked in my pack. It felt like walking through a slow lullaby. There was no shelter in sight for hours, just open space and the soft murmur of weather. And then, as if drawn into being by the quiet itself, we saw a house. A small stone cottage, crouched beneath a wind-bent tree. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and pale in the gray air. We approached slowly, not out of fear, but from the sense that this place did not expect visitors, and one should not knock too loudly on a door that has not opened in years. The door creaked open before I could lift a hand. A man stood there, tall, narrow-shouldered, wrapped in a woolen coat the color of the stone around him. His beard was gray. His eyes were clear, but not sharp, like water in a deep well. He looked at me, then at Modestine. Then he nodded once. No words. Just a nod. An invitation, plain and kind. Inside, the house was dim and warm. A fire crackled in a low hearth. There was a table, a chair, and a wooden bed tucked into the wall. A kettle steamed gently. The scent of wood smoke and thyme filled the air. I did not ask to sit. I did not have to. The man gestured to the chair, then busied himself at the fire. He poured tea into 2 thick ceramic cups and placed one before me. Still no words, and still none were needed. We drank in silence. The tea was bitter and earthy, with something wild in its taste. Rain tapped gently at the windows. Modestine stood beneath the lean-to outside, safe from the weather, chewing slowly, with patient rhythm. At last, the man spoke. "You are walking the old way." His voice was soft, rough at the edges. I nodded, or trying to. He smiled, just barely. Few do now. He asked no questions about my purpose, nor did he offer stories about himself. We shared a meal of stew and black bread, eaten with wooden spoons. Every bite was warm and grounding. When the meal was done, he stood and opened a small cupboard. From it, he took a folded woolen blanket and handed it to me. "For the night," he said simply. I hesitated, not out of pride, but from the strange shyness that comes when offered kindness without condition. Then I accepted. That night I slept on a straw mat by the hearth. The fire crackled low. Outside the rain deepened. I heard the creak of the tree beside the house, swaying gently like an old man humming to himself. The man slept in his bed without a sound, and I, wrapped in his blanket, drifted into sleep with the smell of smoke and herbs in my hair. Morning returned, gray and quiet. The rain had stopped, but mist still clung to the ground. The man was already awake, seated by the fire with a cup in hand. He nodded once when I stirred. No farewell speeches, no good lucks. just bread, a refill of water, and a gesture toward the door when it was time. I stepped outside into the damp morning light. Modestine shook herself and gave a low bray, her way of saying, "Let's get on with it." I turned once to look at the house. The man stood in the doorway, still holding his cup. Behind him, the fire glowed steady. He raised a hand in farewell, not a wave, just a lift of fingers, then stepped inside and closed the door. And that was all. We walked on, the path slick beneath our boots. The air smelled of wet stone and grass. Birds began to sing again, shyly, as if testing the sky. I did not write in my notebook that morning. Some things do not need to be written. Some things are carried.
The sun returned like a friend who had been away, quietly, gently, without grand announcement. By mid-morning, the mist had lifted entirely, and the path ahead glowed with soft gold. Dew shimmered on the grass. Small insects hummed between wildflowers. Even Modestine seemed to step a little lighter, her ears upright, tail flicking in a lazy rhythm. The plateau stretched wide in all directions, an ocean of rolling green, studded with rock and bloom, framed by a distant line of blue hills. There was no village in sight, no road, just the sky above and the trail ahead. We walked without urgency. There was no destination pressing, no promise to keep. Only the quiet and the light, both abundant, both kind. Every few steps, a breeze would lift across the plain and stir the grass like breath across a page. It brought with it the scent of thyme and sun-warmed stone. I found myself humming, a tune I didn't recognize. Perhaps it belonged to the road itself, and I was only borrowing it for a while. Around midday, we came upon a low stone wall. It wound across the field like a seam, irregular, aged, crumbling in places. And beside it sat a shepherd, an old man, still as a tree stump, with a long staff across his lap and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't move as we approached, but I could tell he was awake, his hand slowly stroking the head of a dog curled at his feet, its eyes half closed but watchful. The sheep grazed lazily nearby, white dots scattered across the green, unhurried and peaceful. I nodded in greeting. The man returned it, barely a dip of his head, but full of acknowledgement. Modestine sniffed at the grass, uninterested in ceremony. I took a seat a few steps away on the wall. The stone was warm. For a long time, none of us spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable, just complete, as though any sound would have been extra. The dog stretched and sighed. A sheep bleated softly in the distance. The sky remained high and calm. Eventually, the shepherd said, "Clear day." His voice was dry, like twigs rubbing in the wind. "Yes," I said, "a good one to be out in." He nodded again. "Most days are." And that, I think, was one of the truest things I had heard in a long time. He pulled a hunk of bread from his coat and broke it in two. Without looking, he held one piece out toward me. I accepted it with a quiet thank you, and we chewed in silence. The bread was dense and simple. No butter, no salt, but it tasted right in this place, like something that belonged. As the sun climbed higher, the sheep drifted closer, bells around their necks tinkling in soft conversation. Modestine perked up, curious but respectful. The dog gave her a lazy look, decided she was no threat, and went back to napping. The shepherd shifted slightly. "Not many pass this way,"
he said. I imagine not. Most want roads, towns, certainty. I don't mind getting a little lost. He smiled, not with his mouth, but with the corners of his eyes. That's the only way to find anything worth finding. We sat together until the sun began its slow descent. The air cooled, just a little. Shadows lengthened. The sheep moved in slow waves across the grass. I stood. He didn't stop me, just gave a slow nod as if to say, "You've stayed the right amount." I reached into my pack and left a small apple on the stone beside him. Not payment, not charity, just a passing of something sweet in return. He didn't look at it, but I'm sure he knew. Back on the path, the world felt a little larger, not because it had changed, but because I had stepped into a stillness that somehow made the sky wider, the air gentler. Modestine walked with steady rhythm beside me. We didn't speak, of course, but her ears flicked now and then in agreement with my thoughts. By dusk, we found a patch of wild thyme by a shallow stream. I set up camp there. The ground was soft, the stream slow and clear. The fire crackled politely, and Modestine settled down near the edge of light. As I stirred the evening soup, more broth than substance, I thought about the shepherd, about the way he had said so little, yet left behind the impression of a library. Some people are like that. They don't talk often, but when they do, their words land like stones in a still pool, and the ripples go on and on. That night, the stars returned early, bright, without rush. The sky seemed lower than usual, not heavy, but close, as if the ceiling of the world had bent a little to listen. I wrote one line in my notebook. Some silences are not empty. They are full of presence. Then I let the fire burn down. Modestine breathed slow beside me, and the world fell quiet again, a silence full of life.
Morning came with a silver hush. No wind, no bird song, just a cool, damp silence wrapping the world like soft wool. I woke slowly. Modestine stood nearby, already awake, staring out into the mist. She didn't pray or shuffle, just waited, still and calm, as if she too sensed the world was in no hurry today. We packed our few things, more by feel than sight, and stepped back onto the path. The mist was thick and low. It clung to the grass and curled around stones, drifting in pale sheets across the earth. The trail ahead disappeared after just a few feet. We were walking into the unknown, but it felt safe, like wandering through the inside of a quiet dream. Even our footsteps were muffled. There was no sound except for the soft swish of grass beneath our boots and the occasional rustle of Modestine's harness. After about an hour, the land dipped. We descended gently into a valley, one I hadn't seen on any map. The mist pooled thick here, and the air grew cooler, tinged with the scent of damp moss and something older, more distant. Then, through the fog, shapes began to appear. Not people, not houses, but ruins, stone arches, broken walls, crumbled stairways that led nowhere. The remains of what might have once been a monastery or a fortress, or perhaps something older still. No signs, no names, just stone, slowly dissolving back into earth. I stood at the edge, letting the mist swirl around me. The silence deepened. Even Modestine paused. We stepped forward carefully, as if not to disturb whatever memory lived here. Vines crept across ancient stones,
A shattered pillar leaned at a quiet angle, covered in lichen like a forgotten relic wearing a wool coat. Birds, if there were any, chose not to sing in this place. Time didn't feel real here. Past and present seemed to breathe together. I placed a hand on one of the walls. The stone was damp, cold, and deeply pitted, touched by centuries of rain and wind. It felt like touching sleep. In the center of the ruins, we found a small open space. There, in a perfect ring, grew 6 cypress trees, tall, still, watching. And beneath them, an old stone bench, cracked but intact. I sat down and stayed. Not to rest my feet, but because something in this place asked for quiet, and I answered. I don't know how long we sat there, me on the bench, Modestine grazing nearby in the mist, but it was long enough for the silence to settle inside my chest like breath I hadn't known I was holding, long enough for the rhythm of this valley to become mine. And then, very gently, the mist began to lift. The edges of the ruin sharpened. The hills beyond emerged like sleeping giants. The trees reclaimed their colors. And birds, just one at first, began to sing again, as if the hush had been lifted. I stood. One last glance at the stone bench, at the cypress ring, at whatever invisible thing lingered here, ancient and kind. Then we walked on. By midday, the sun was warm on our backs. The trail rose steadily, leading us out of the valley and onto a ridge. From there, I looked back. The ruins were gone from sight, hidden again in folds of land and memory. I wasn't sure they'd still be there if someone else went looking. Some places, I think, only appear when you need them, and then they disappear again. Not lost, just waiting. We made camp that evening beside a trickling stream, the kind of stream that sings to itself. I washed my hands and face in its cool current, then brewed tea from a few sprigs of wild mint. The smell drifted up like a gentle answer to no particular question. Modestine nibbled at a patch of grass, content. The fire crackled, and above us, the sky turned a soft lavender blue. I wrote just one sentence that night. The world is full of places that ask nothing of you, only your presence. Then I closed my book, poured the last of the tea, and watched as the stars took their places, one by one, like candles being lit in a darkened room. Sleep came easily, and the valley came with it, not in memory, but in feeling. A hush, a pause, a place outside of time. The air that morning was thin and cold, not harsh, just clean, as if the sky had taken a deep breath during the night and forgotten to exhale. I woke beneath my blanket with the tip of my nose cold and my fingers curled in for warmth. Modestine stood close, the breath rising in small clouds, ears twitching with the quiet sounds of the forest. We were higher now. The trees had changed. Gone were the soft, leafy woods of the valleys. These were pines, tall, straight, still. Their trunks rose like pillars in a silent cathedral, their needles whispering secrets in a breeze too soft to be heard. We didn't speak. There was no need. The morning had its own kind of language, the crunch of frost underfoot, the hush of wind through trees, the creak of Modestine's pack straps as we climbed the slope. I let my thoughts drift, not forward, not back, just sideways, into the rhythm of walking. the comfort of breath, the quiet companionship of my little donkey. After an hour or so, we came upon a clearing. Tucked into one corner, nearly hidden beneath a curtain of pine boughs, was a cabin, very small, very old. Its roof sagged slightly under the weight of years, and the door hung half open, but the stones were sturdy, and smoke stains still marked the chimney, signs of a place once loved. I stepped inside. Dust, dry leaves, the faint, sweet smell of wood long since burned. There was a bench, a small hearth, a table built from rough planks, uneven but strong. I set down my pack, and Modestine found a patch of sun near the doorway. She stretched out her legs, rare for her, and closed her eyes. I smiled. It felt right to stay a while. Outside, the sun rose just high enough to gild the tops of the trees. Inside, I lit a tiny fire in the hearth, using dry pine needles and twigs. The flame caught easily, dancing in amber and gold. The smoke curled up the flue with a faint sigh. I brewed tea, a mixture of mint and something like chamomile I had picked days before. The steam rose in delicate ribbons. The first sip warmed my chest like a memory. I sat at the crooked table, notebook open, pen in hand. But I didn't write. Instead, I watched a patch of light move slowly across the floorboards, dust motes turning in the beam like tiny stars. Outside, the world whispered in pine. No one passed, no voices, no footsteps, only stillness and the crackle of fire. Eventually, I wrote, "Some mornings arrive not to be used, but to be noticed." Then I closed the notebook, drank the last of the tea, and leaned back against the stone wall, listening to nothing in particular. We stayed in the cabin until the sun moved west, not because we were tired, but because there was no reason to rush. The trail would wait. It always did. Before we left, I swept the floor with a bundle of dry twigs and straightened the bench, left a piece of bread wrapped in cloth on the shelf in case the next traveler came hungry. Then I stepped out into the light. Modestine yawned, and the forest welcomed us back like an old friend. The trail led downward, winding between trees that stood like sentinels. The ground was soft, cushioned with pine needles. The air held that sweet, resinous scent that only conifers know, clean and slightly sharp, like something that wants to be remembered. Birds began to sing again as we descended. One here, one there. Never all at once. Just enough to remind us that the world was awake. We camped that night in a hollow beside a fallen tree. The stars came early, peeking through gaps in the canopy like shy visitors. I lit a modest fire, more for light than warmth. Modestine lay down close, her breath slow and steady, the flickering glow casting long shadows across her soft gray coat. I didn't write that night. Didn't need to. Some days leave nothing behind but feeling, and that's more than enough.
There was no sign, no marker, no carved stone or painted post to say you are now leaving the path. But we knew. The trail, once clear, began to thin, from earth to gravel, from gravel to stone, from stone to memory. And then, nothing. Just rock, just sky, just the wind brushing the cliffs like a hand over worn pages. Modestine hesitated. Her ears twitched. She stepped carefully, each hoof pressing down with quiet concern. I paused beside her, scanning the land. To the left, a drop into pine-covered shadow. To the right, a rise of sharp stone, jagged and bare. Ahead, only lichen-covered rock, sloping gently upward like the back of a sleeping giant. No footsteps, no wheel ruts,
no direction. But the sun was steady, and the air was clear, and the mountain, though silent, did not feel unfriendly. So we climbed, slowly, with no rush and no map. Every so often I'd see something that looked like a path, a line of stones, a worn patch of moss, a curve in the land. Then it would vanish again, swallowed by the mountain's quiet logic. But I was not afraid. Some landscapes are not meant to be read, only felt. So we followed the feeling. By midday, we reached a kind of plateau, a high shoulder of the mountain where the wind was gentler and the sky wider. The silence here was different, not empty, but full, as if the air itself were watching. And there, nestled into the rock, was a structure. Not quite a house, not quite a ruin. A stone shelter, low-roofed, half covered in moss, its single door hanging open like an exhale. I ducked inside. Dry, cool, the scent of old stone and mountain herbs. Someone, long ago, had stacked flat rocks into a bench along one wall. A small recess in the corner held the remains of a hearth, blackened but intact. Modestine poked her head in, snorted softly, then backed out to graze on a patch of tough grass nearby. I sat on the stone bench and let the silence settle in. No words, no pen, no fire, just stillness. The wind outside sang in small breaths. Inside, I leaned back against the wall and closed my eyes. And for a while, I was nowhere. Not lost, not found, just nowhere. I awoke to the sound of hoofbeats. Not many, just one or two. I stepped outside and saw, far down the slope, a lone goat clambering across a narrow ledge. No shepherd in sight, just the goat, moving with confidence I envied. Then it disappeared behind a ridge, and the mountain held its breath again. The afternoon light turned honey-colored. Shadows stretched. The breeze grew cooler, carrying the scent of wild thyme and iron-rich earth. I boiled water on a tiny fire I built from dry twigs and pine cones, and dropped in a handful of mountain herbs I'd collected over the past few days. The tea was sharp and earthy, the kind that makes you more awake as the world quiets around you. Modestine returned from her grazing and stood nearby, tail flicking lazily. I shared half a biscuit with her, dry but comforting. She took it with her usual mix of suspicion and grace. The two of us sat together in the fading light, and for a moment I felt like a guest in the house of the sky. That night I stayed in the shelter. It was barely large enough to lie down, but the stone was warm from the sun, and the roof kept the wind at bay. I laid my blanket across the bench and watched the stars appear through the open doorway, one by one, shy and slow. Some nights are loud with thought. This one was not. This one asked nothing. Before sleep came, I wrote, "When the road disappears, the mountain listens." Then I set down my pen, closed my eyes, and let the silence carry me like a current through deep water into rest. Morning found us wrapped in pale blue mist. The shelter was still. The stone bench beneath me was cold, but not unkind. I rose slowly, stretched, and stepped out into the hush. Modestine, as ever, was already awake. She waited without complaint, ears flicking, watching the world wake up. we descended the mountain in silence. The path, if you could call it that, reappeared in patches. A rock worn smooth by boots long gone. A line of grass bent just slightly more than the rest. We followed where the land allowed. By midday, we reached the edge of a valley. It wasn't marked on any map I had, and even if it were, it would have deserved no name but its own beauty. Green, soft, breathing. The valley spread out like a forgotten page of a lullaby. Quiet streams curling like ribbon through meadows. Clusters of trees bent as if whispering to one another. In the center, smoke, thin and straight, rising from a chimney that belonged to a little house of clay and stone. We approached slowly. There was no path to the door, just a scattering of flat rocks placed with care. Modestine paused at the edge of the trees and began to graze. I stepped closer and knocked, not loudly, just enough to say, "I'm here, but only if you want me to be." A moment passed. Then the door opened. An old man stood there, hair the color of ash, hands stained with something darker. Clay, earth, time. He looked at me, then at the donkey, then back at me, and he smiled. "Tea?" he asked. I nodded. Inside was warmth, not the kind made by fire, though there was a fire crackling in a corner, but the warmth of hands and tools and silence used well. Shelves lined the walls, filled with bowls, jars, teapots, each one slightly imperfect in a way that made them beautiful. The man moved slowly but surely. He placed a chipped kettle over the flame. We didn't speak at first. He sat across from me, a small mug in each hand. He offered one, then took a sip from his own. The tea was strong, earthy, floral, bitter at first, then soft, like the land. "Live here long?" I asked, eventually. He nodded, then shrugged. "A while," he said. "Maybe longer." Then silence again, but not uncomfortable, just full. He showed me the workshop. Just behind the main room, a wide wooden wheel sat in shadow. The floor was covered in flecks of dried clay. A small shelf held the beginnings of a new vase, tall, uneven, lovely. He picked it up, turned it slowly in his hands, said nothing, then placed it back. I stayed for maybe an hour, maybe two. Time didn't tick here. It drifted. I bought a small bowl from him, round, simple, the color of faded moss. He wrapped it in soft cloth and handed it to me like a gift, not a transaction, a parting. Before I left, I asked his name. He hesitated, then said, "Doesn't matter," then smiled again. I walked back to Modestine with the bowl tucked gently in my pack. We resumed our journey, heading down into the lower part of the valley, where the grass grew tall and soft under our feet. The trees thinned, the sun drifted lower, and behind me, smoke still rose from that chimney, a single line in the still air. That night, we camped beside a quiet brook. Modestine lay curled beneath a tree, her back rising and falling in time with the breeze. I lit no fire, made no tea, just sat with the bowl in my hands, tracing its uneven edge with my thumb. I thought of the potter, his silence, his hands, his house of clay and wood. Before sleep, I wrote, "Some people shape earth, some shape silence. The best do both." Then I folded the blanket over my shoulders, closed my eyes, and let the gentle breath of the valley carry me to dreams.
We woke to light, not the gray shimmer of mountain mist, nor the filtered gold of forest shade, but light, wide, clear, undeniable. The valley had opened overnight. The trees were fewer now, the air tinged with salt. Even Modestine seemed to know. We were close. The road beneath our feet was no longer wild. It had become something else, not paved, not worn, but expectant. I walked slower than usual, not out of weariness, but out of that quiet reluctance that comes when something good nears its end. Modestine plodded along beside me, faithful, unhurried, patient as always. Around mid-morning, the trees gave way entirely. Ahead of us, the land dipped, and then rose, and then stopped. And beyond that, blue. Endless, glittering blue. The sea. It was the first time I had seen it in weeks. And even now, from such distance, it felt unreal, like a dream someone had left unfolded on the horizon. I stood there for a long time, said nothing. Just let it wash over me. Not the sea itself, but the idea of it. We walked the final stretch in silence. The wind carried the cry of gulls, the scent of salt and seaweed, and something else I couldn't name, something old and wide and soft, a memory I hadn't lived, but recognized anyway. The trail ended at a bluff. Below, rocks, waves, and sky. No harbor, no village, just the honest edge of the land. I took off my pack and sat. Modestine wandered a few steps away and found a patch of wild grass to chew on, her ears turning slowly with the wind. The ocean moved like sleep, slow, constant, infinite. Waves rolled in and rolled back, never hurrying. I breathed deeply, not with purpose, but with permission, as if the sea had offered me rest and I'd finally accepted it. After some time, I don't know how long, I reached into my pack and took out the little moss-green bowl from the potter's house. I filled it with water from my flask, held it in my hands, let the sunlight catch its uneven glaze, then poured the water gently onto the ground beside me. A quiet offering, a way to say thank you. Modestine came to stand beside me. She looked out at the sea as if she too had made the journey for this moment. I rested a hand on her shoulder. Neither of us spoke. Eventually, the sun began its descent. Colors bloomed across the water, gold, rose, violet. The wind cooled, and the day, like the journey, began to fold itself up. That night we did not travel further. We stayed on the bluff, curled beneath the stars. No fire, no tea, just the hush of the waves below and the slow rhythm of breath. I opened my notebook one last time, wrote only one sentence. We walked through silence to find silence waiting. Then I closed it, set it aside, and lay back against the earth. Modestine sighed, a soft, contented sound, the kind that says, enough. The stars above blinked awake, the sea whispered, and the world turned gently on.
And now, dear traveler, if you are still here,
still breathing gently beside the slow turning of the world. I hope this little journey has brought you a moment of quiet, a soft place to rest your thoughts, a pause in the long river of your day. You've walked through valleys and woods, listened to the hush of wind through pine, the creak of old leather, the steady step of a small and faithful donkey. You've sipped tea with strangers, shared silence with stars, and watched the sea welcome the sky. And now, it is time to let go. There is nothing more you need to do. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your shoulders fall. Let the story you've heard dissolve into the gentle rhythm of your breath. The world will still be here when you wake. The sea will still whisper. The hills will still hum. And somewhere, far or near, another path will be waiting. But not tonight. Tonight is for sleep. So rest, dreamer. You have traveled far, and you are safe now. Thank you for walking with us, for trusting the quiet, for letting the soft voice of story carry you gently into the folds of night. We'll be here again soon, another evening, another path, another tale. Until then, good night. Sleep well, and may peace find you wherever you are.